Welcome back to the Practical Spirituality Podcast. We are so excited to have you on this journey with us, where we explore all elements of mind, body, emotions, and soul through the lens of everyday life. We love recording this show and are very appreciative of all the positive feedback we've been getting and the thousands of listeners who are tuning in every week. The show does take a lot of time and effort and investment from us. We would love to keep this going, and we need your help to do it. Please support the show by joining our community at Patreon. Our Patreon community get ongoing access to new and exclusive episodes, even after the completion of this initial season. You can find the link in our podcast bio in the description of each episode, or you can go to www.patreon.com/Practical Spirituality Podcast. On this week's episode, we're exploring the fascinating topic of intuition, learning how to trust it, and coming to the realization that we all experience it in different ways. So, Gareth, I really want to ask you about how did you know when you got that inner knowing that it was intuition? How did you start to recognize that?
I think when it comes to intuition, it's a really interesting topic because to me, intuition is to do with your energy and how it flows through the different layers of your being. So I think intuition can be communicated through areas of your mind, body, emotions, and all directed from your soul. And I think depending on what you're going through with that particular part of your life, your intuition is there to help guide you on your next step of your journey, so to speak. And it uses those different ways to communicate that to you. Probably at that time, the best way you'll actually listen or to be able to take note of it.
That's interesting. Because as you're talking, I'm thinking about when was the first time I recognized my intuition. And I'd have to say it was a time when my sister was about to get married. And I just knew this guy was not a good guy. But I didn't know how to share that with anybody. So, I mean, I'm sure I had experiences earlier than that, but I would not have recognized them as intuition.
So even in that moment for you, in what way did that intuition, do you feel, came to you? Was it through your mind, your emotions? Was it, because it can often be layered as well. It's not ever just one single part of you that it communicates through. So in that example for you, how did you feel that intuition was being put across?
Well, the very first time she brought him to the house was for him to ask Dad, if he could marry her. And he walked in the door and every part of my body just went, ugh, no, yeah, something wrong with this person. But I didn't, I was young. I didn't know how to articulate that. And so my mom tells a story about when I was 3 or 4, there was a gentleman that came to the house to do some like electrical work or something. And she said that I just went running to her, clung to her leg and wouldn't let go.
Yeah.
And the guy seemed like a really nice guy, but I just was like, no, don't want to be near this person. So it came more as that, that sense of there's something wrong. It was just a yucky feeling inside of me is the best way I can describe it.
I think a lot of people can experience intuition, probably have more memories of the negative association with it, of a situation not being right. And I think the definition of often with intuition is a sense of knowing about something, but not knowing where they're getting the information from. It's just that off feeling. Often people would say it's from my gut feeling.
Right.
Is obviously the term that a lot of people would probably recognize hearing. Obviously feeling in that deep part of your gut, of that pit of your stomach even, is normally when there's something uncomfortable with the situation more often than not. But as we both experience, you can also feel it in the best ways too, because I honestly think when people say I have a bad gut feeling on this, on the other side of it, people say I have butterflies in my stomach, which is also to do with your intuition.
And I've often wondered about that because, I dismissed the butterflies in my stomach because every time I followed the butterflies in my stomach, it didn't always turn out well. So, but maybe that's because I was looking for something other than what those butterflies were telling me. So why is that then that when we're so keyed into, oh, that doesn't feel great, I should pay attention to that. But if it feels good, we don't necessarily pay attention to it or we dismiss it. Why do you think that is?
I think especially when we're feeling the butterflies come through, it goes back to our ability to want to process the positive in our life and actually to have something to look forward to, or something, or to be hopeful about how something might develop. Because often we find ourselves wanting to believe in the positives moving forward in life, or often needing to be excited about something because we don't really know how to process maybe some of the more difficult times we're currently living through. So especially when we get the feeling of something good is coming along and we can't logically explain it, that even more excites us versus someone just telling it to us logically. It hits differently. So therefore, often to say love is blind, also butterflies in your stomach can also make you blind to some of the realities of going on as well. But again, even though I know in previous episodes we've talked about how we don't have a good relationship with our negative emotions or the negative associations with our thoughts or emotions, when it's a negative gut feeling or that intuition telling you, though, it is incredibly hard to ignore that at the same time as well, because it's not just a thought, or it's not just an emotion. It's actually a combination, and there's more of an intensity that comes along with that intuition, whether it be positive or negative, in my experience.
I would agree with that. And so as you're saying all of that, I'm thinking, I've had an image come to my mind and I'm smiling about it because I remember when I met my first love, I remember looking up and seeing him. And to me, it just felt like a real recognition. And I got excited and I literally walked over to him and said, well, where have you been? Like, why is it taking you so long to show up? And I remember going, well, basically I was waiting for you to show up. And that was our very first exchange. Because it was like this instant recognition. And so I identify with what you're saying about the positive. So my curiosity then is, and what has always confused me is sometimes I don't really understand what my intuition is trying to tell me. And what is the point of that intuition? Positive and negative.
I think it comes back to our ability to explore it with another person, or even having the comfortability to communicate it, because often it is very difficult to figure out really any of these signals on our own. It's not impossible, but if we don't really understand the relationship with our emotions, and we have a difficult relationship with our mind, and often sometimes a difficult relationship with our body, suddenly if intuition is coming through and trying to give us a message through those streams, it's going to be a very difficult one then to figure out what it's trying to communicate to us, because it's as if your intuition at that particular time is speaking French, but you only recognize Italian through those three means of communication. So therefore it's like, I don't know where to begin to decode what this feeling is trying to tell me, but you can't deny that you're hearing it or that it exists.
I would agree with that. And then, of course, with the upbringing that I had, I recognize now that I was in a lot of fear. And so let's talk about how does the anxiety and the fear interfere with our intuition and our ability to understand that?
Often when it comes to any sort of information that comes from our intuition, there is normally an element of fear that comes along with it, even when it is the butterflies, as you're saying, because even when if you feel the butterflies of a really nice situation, the fear comes in of, am I actually falling deeply in love with this person? And the fear of being heartbroken and everything else is this real? But then when it's a negative gut feeling or intuition that comes along and we can't figure out what's wrong or what could potentially be wrong with our surrounding, what's in common with both of those things is that it presents us with a lack of control and the unknown. That we don't like being in that situation of not knowing and not being in control. And no matter what way the intuition or that awareness is brought up into us, it brings up our difficult relationship with those parts of us. And that's why we struggle with often any kind of intuition that comes to light.
And so I guess, that's one of the things from my experience. And so I'll share a story with you. When I was younger and I had a paper route, I used to have a little mini moped type bike that I would ride and do my paper route. And I was almost 16 and something had happened to the bike. So I was on foot and they were building a new neighborhood behind my house. And I used to cut through the field to get to the other neighborhood to deliver. But now I was cutting through this construction site. And for a couple mornings in a row, I noticed a guy out jogging and I didn't pay any attention to him. And I think you need to understand, for me at that time in my life, I felt like I owned the early morning hours, like, because I was always awake. I would start my paper out at 4:00 in the morning. There was never anyone up. I would watch people wake up. I knew people's routines from their houses, from that sort of thing. And on this one particular morning, I was cutting through the construction site, and I noticed that the guy was cutting through the construction site behind me. And I remember thinking, well, that's weird if he's jogging. And that was the first thought that I had, was, oh, that's weird. But then I started noticing that when I slowed down, he slowed down. And then when I sped up, he sped up. And of course, there was a fair amount of fear, but it wasn't totally overridden. So I'm trying to remember to explain it exactly what happened, because I don't know what made me make the decision. But at one point, I changed my route and went a different way, because I knew there was a gentleman that was always up at 5:15 in the morning. I always waved to him in the morning when he was making his coffee. And on this particular morning, as soon as I got to his house, I just went straight up the driveway and walked in the back door. The poor gentleman was in his underwear, right? And I couldn't speak. But what happened, I just kept pointing out to the front, because obviously the fear had gotten so big inside of me, I couldn't speak. And the guy was standing out in his front yard waiting for me to come back out. And so he called the police, and the person was arrested, and blah, 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 blah. But that to me is an indication. Now, I wasn't overly afraid. Did I have conscious knowledge that I was going to walk up that driveway and walk in that person's house? No, that just kind of happened. And so to me, I call that an inner knowing. And is that inner knowing the same as the intuition?
Yeah. And because I also feel in those moments that if we look at any of our lives, we actually have so many more examples that we've just kind of brushed past as we continue to go through life in so many ways. And I also feel that there are times where the intuition is there to try to get our awareness, but then there's also parts of it where that inner knowing actually guides us to the point of it's actually out of our control. So all of a sudden you were in that man's house, which was obviously not part of your normal routine, but there was parts of that Kim didn't have control of, if you want to say. Suddenly you were there.
Yes. And it often confused me, especially when I had to go down. I was 15, almost 16, and I had to go down to the police department and make a statement. My father was there, and, they were grilling me about, at what point did you decide you needed safety? I was like, at no point. Like, I didn't make that decision. And I didn't know how to explain to him. I just kind of found myself going into his house. And it wasn't until he was trying to talk to me that I realized I must have been in a fearful state because I couldn't speak. So it's interesting. And again, and then I refer back to that time when I met my first love. And there was an instant recognition and an instant knowing. Just knew. I actually remember thinking, this is a long lost friend that I've been waiting for, and he's finally shown up, is how it felt to me at that moment. So I guess, as someone who has run a fair amount of anxiety in my life, and the anxiety, of course, is all about that needing to control the unknown and what's possibly going to happen. In those instances that I've just described, I guess I did trust my intuition, but I know as I got older and the anxiety became more intense, I didn't trust anything. So how do we learn how to trust that?
I think in order to learn how to trust it, we have to go back to and understand why we would have possibly lost trust with it at any given point. And it's clear when we were very young or as children, we didn't know any different. And I know through previous conversations between you and I, Kim, we often know that emotions and energy and that intuition is often our first language before we go on to learn any other language, English, French, Italian, the list goes on, Spanish. Intuition and emotions are our first language. But it's only as we continue to actually grow up that becomes less important, because we're obviously very much a part of a logical world and we have to explain everything and everything has to make a lot of sense. And of course, there's a lot of that that's very healthy. But as in some of your examples there, or as we were talking about, when it comes to intuition and our feeling on certain things, it can be very hard to explain logically why we feel the way we do about something. All we know is that emotion, or that there's that intensity there in that moment in time that you don't have any choice but to follow. So, but as we are growing up in within our families or with our carers, we begin to see that we do have these moments of intuition of something not being right, certain situations, and often we relay that back to often our parents or our carers. But if it's not making sense to them at that particular time, they begin to make you feel that what you're feeling is somewhat irrelevant or not accurate, or the information is actually not that helpful to the situation. So therefore, if you begin to see that the people you look up to are not valuing that intuition that's important to you, is actually there to help guide you, then of course you begin to develop a very complicated relationship with your own intuition and begin to question it, because all you've seen in your life is other people question it too.
I definitely would agree with that. And so basically what I think I'm hearing you say is, I think we all learned that as our first language. But then depending on how that's received and the environment that we grow up in is how we develop that relationship with it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So to answer your question on the sense of even developing relationship with it, even as an adult now, step one is recognizing why we find it so hard to trust to begin with. But then step one in the process of actually understanding and building relationship with your intuition is actually by listening to it and admitting that it exists, and that when you're feeling it, that it's real, even if you can't put words to it or you don't know how to communicate to it. It's about actually trusting in that part of you that's trying to communicate something to you. And so step one is just recognizing that it exists, which even as adults, we still don't often do.
Well, and I certainly understand that, because one of the questions I was going to say or ask about is, I felt for a long time that I shut my intuition off. Like it felt like it was turned off or tuned out or whatever you want to call it. And I think the more my anxiety grew and the more negative experiences and fearful experiences I had, I don't think it actually got turned off, but it got drowned out, is what I would say, through the fear. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah, because there is a period of time, and as we've talked about before in some ways, there's certain times in our life where intuition is meant to be quite intense, and especially throughout very particular periods. And in a perfect world, there is a stage or a place we could potentially be in where we listen to our intuition all the time. But to do that, that does take a lot of development and balance in mind, body, emotions, and soul. I've yet to meet any person who has 100% accomplished that, so I wouldn't be holding my breath. But at the same time, that's also part of what I believe is the life plan of there's meant to be certain times where it's meant to be very intense, and other times where it is somewhat meant to be drowned out by life, because of certain experiences that you only go through when that intuition or that knowing isn't present. Otherwise, you wouldn't have went through certain experiences.
And so why is it you think that little kids or children are more tuned into their intuition, or at least some? So, because my experience with kids, I've seen quite a few kids. Some are very intuitive and some are not.
I think, never mind just children, I think every person is quite in tune, but they play to their own tune as well, depending on what they're here to experience. And it's not about whether they're in tune or not. It's more about how they are conditioning their tuning.
And so are they the ones actually conditioning that, or is that the people around them conditioning that?
Both, depending on the circumstance. That's no one's fault at the same time, because if you're not aware that that's what's going on, then therefore you can't change it or even possibly admit that that's what's happening. So it's no one's fault in those positions, but it's only through certain experiences and through knowledge and exploration that you can begin to have an awareness on these different parts of you. But the intuition is always present, but even when it's there, doesn't mean that we want to listen to it.
Yeah. And so would you say that's because, and I try and understand this sometimes mostly from my point of view and from, my own personal experiences. And so I'm hearing you say these things and I go, was it because I had such a bad relationship with my emotions and, what I call flip-flopped, the emotional stuff didn't work for me. So now I'm going to go to the analytical stuff. And because it was so confusing that I naturally didn't really listen to my intuition because I didn't have a great relationship with my emotions.
It's partly true. Because even from us beginning this conversation, we're talking about the intuition, that gut feeling being a feeling itself. But at the very start of the conversation, we also talked about how the intuition works through mind, body, emotions, and all led by the soul. So therefore, it's not uncommon to experience the intensity of intuition coming through just the mind, or the intuition of just coming through the emotions, and then also through the body. And you relate back to an experience there of the intuition flow through your body, and suddenly you were walking into that man's house.
Right.
So it's actually the intuition flow through you in that particular way. And then if it's through emotions, that's when there can be really deep feeling. But then there can be intuition that comes through particular you exploring certain thoughts as well. So that's why sometimes we could be more turning towards the logical, sometimes we're turning more towards the emotional, sometimes we're turning more towards the physical. But then, of course, depending on the experience, these areas can also overlap. So not trying to overcomplicate it, but the intuition can just flow in so many different ways. But yeah, we call it a gut feeling because that's the main one we tend to recognize. But we tend to recognize that one because when it's intense, we can't ignore it because we don't have a good relationship with our emotions. So when that comes through in our emotions, it normally takes us by surprise because we're used to trying to feel as little as possible.
Okay, so now I have a real good question for you. And because it's relating to how you just described that. So, when I had that experience just before I got sober and my little event on the bottom of the ocean and sitting on that boat, the person I was with threw a beer at me and said, "Here, open a beer and, calm yourself down." And I went to open the beer as I was sitting there. I heard a voice in my head say, as loudly and clearly as you and I are talking, maybe, just maybe if you put the alcohol down long enough, you'll figure out why your life's so messed up. It was so loud that I literally thought it was the guy who was on the boat with me. And when I turned, he wasn't there. He was back at the engines. I thought that was spiritual guidance. So was that spiritual guidance or was that intuition or both?
What's the difference?
I don't know. That's what I'm asking you. What is the difference?
And I think this is where it can be when it comes to our intuition, again, mind, body, emotions, all powered by the soul or led by the soul. We can experience it in all different ways. And that's also what's quite exciting about it. We often focus so much on the external that we forget about how amazing the internal can be in these different layers. So your intuition is amazing at being able to capture your attention, especially if you're in the middle of doing something. So therefore, in that particular moment, your energy, your grace, your spirit knew exactly how to get your attention that moment in time, just for you to have an awareness or even a spiritual awakening, shall we say, just to look at things a little bit differently.
It was definitely a reset moment. It caught my attention completely. I couldn't have ignored it if I wanted to. And so I think that's where I get confused, and maybe other people would get confused because, once you start on this journey of exploring these different parts of yourself, of course, like everyone else, I got enamored with, getting guidance from outside of myself, wanting, to be special and have someone giving me that guidance in my ear. And so that's where I think I got it confused. I mean, when I look back on it now, it was all of those things, a spiritual awakening, it was intuition, it was guidance. It was definitely a moment in my life that my life was going to take a complete about face. And I guess for people that are on this journey, it's how do we decipher all those confusing parts? How can we learn to go? So in other words, I think, how can we learn to trust that intuition? Because I don't know why I did in that moment on the boat. Maybe because it was so loud. I definitely, in the moment that it happened, I mean, I was shocked and looked around to see who it was. But I remember then thinking, okay, maybe I'll just not drink this and see what happens. I didn't feel like I had a spiritual awakening. I didn't feel like I was being spoken to by anybody else. And I don't think I consciously put it down to intuition, but I knew I couldn't move forward in the same way.
Because a lot of the intuition or those moments, it happens in order to catch our attention, to knock us out of autopilot. And that's exactly what happens in those moments. And for a number of reasons, and obviously it depends on how you were raised and the parents you had or the carers you had. But our entire lives, we were always told how we should do something, and we never really had the opportunity to look within to figure it out ourselves. So it's not surprising when it comes to spiritual journey of understanding why these things are happening, what is the intuition, how to make sense of this, that we suddenly turn to other people. But that's where it also gets exciting when you begin to understand that intuition actually, even when you feel you're hearing it externally, is actually coming from within, planned by you through the different levels of mind, body, emotions, directed by the soul. Mm-hmm. So it's more we're at the habit of always searching within others what we think that they can give us to make us at peace with ourselves. And it's only through doing the journey and by questioning and often digging in the different areas of mind, body, emotions that you begin to understand and see the patterns and behaviors over many years of how much it was actually coming from the inside out, not the outside in. And that's an awakening within itself of realizing how much of your answers are actually within. I think it takes most people by surprise.
Well, yes, I think it would, because it took me a very long time to understand that the guidance was coming from within. And also the pain was coming from within, but the pain was coming from within in order to help me understand something else. So what will happen, and what does happen if we choose not to listen to that intuition?
There's been actually so much intuition over the years that we ignored, but it's also because we were meant to ignore it. When it comes to ignoring your intuition, there is a level of us that's able to recognize it, but ignoring it might be not communicating it to another person or maybe taking action on it in the way that maybe you thought you would, but then you actually just put it to the side. So there is always that recognition of the intuition or the event actually occurring from within. So it depends on what you're defining as, ignoring it or not acting on it. But more often than not, the intuition is not always there for us to act on it. It's just more the recognition of, as I said, knocking us out of autopilot, which it does 100% of the time.
Yeah, I find that very interesting. And I find that very interesting because, a lot of times as you talk, what happens to me is these little images pop up in my head and of experiences that I have. And of course, one of the ones that stands out is that time that I told you just before I got married, and I didn't act on that. And, every single time I think that it's been big, it has caught my attention. And I haven't always acted on it. And I've often wondered, was that a point in my life where I could have turned and gone in another direction and I just didn't?
And the answer is no. And I know we're both aware of that because we can't change the past, for starters.
Yeah.
But also it's that when we talk about how intuition works in different layers of you at any given point, it's that you had the awareness in that moment in time from your intuition, mentally and emotionally, of, is this right for me? But intuition was also walking your legs down the aisle.
That's true.
Because it was part of your path to be married to this particular individual.
This is very true. But you can't, so isn't it just human nature to then go, well, if I had listened to my intuition, would things have been differently?
And the thing is, that's human nature to think that way because we don't understand every layer of it more often than not, because we don't have the individuals to talk it out with who also have explored it in different ways from their own experience. Because like many things we talk about in this podcast, there's no right or wrong. There's no strict definition, anything we're talking about.
So I want to jump in here and say, in hindsight, looking back on all of it, when I look back at that moment, so I'm going to say it in my language, I think I had a sacred contract with this individual. And even though I questioned it at that moment, and I still walked down the aisle and had 3 beautiful children and, had a lot of experiences, I think, and of course, this is my language again, the contract I had was he was here. We were both there to teach each other things, but he was definitely there to teach me right from that very beginning to find my voice. I didn't find my voice in that moment, and it took me another 20 years before I found my voice. So in hindsight, instead of going, naturally I've asked that question because I think we all would ask that question. Well, would my life have been different if I'd gone through door number 2 instead of door number 1? But at going through it, having experienced it, coming through the other side, I can look back at all that entire journey that I walked with my ex-husband as that part of me learning how to speak my truth for me and stand in my own self-awareness.
And I feel, but this is exactly why we can't control the past. But even when we're in that scenario where we do question, is this right for me? And it's not a choice. It's because of the emotional development that you're talking about, and that journey we end up going on. From listening to you, it's not that you regret any of those moments, shall we say, now looking back. But that's often due to, because as you said, you have 3 wonderful kids, you had a number of experiences. It led you down a very, I was going to say interesting life path. It led you down
It did.
But in saying all that, that was exactly the point of why we had to go through them. Often when it comes to these particular experiences, and if we find ourselves going, what if I had have listened to that intuition, and what if I had have not went down the aisle that day? Well, we're only saying that if we still don't understand why it needed to happen that way to begin with, because we haven't explored it all mentally and emotionally yet.
Agreed. I would 100% agree with that, because I often asked it through those years of my marriage, and I have no regrets. I am, very happy for the fact that I was married at that time, the lessons I learned, the beautiful children I have. And to be perfectly honest, I have great respect for my ex-husband in the fact that when I had the awareness that maybe we had this contract and it's never one-sided, but I often would go, okay, what was his contract with me and what was my contract with him? Mm-hmm. In order to walk away from it, when I had the realization that, maybe his contract was to love me till I did stand up and speak up, it shifted how I felt about him, because I then gained a great deal of respect that he must have loved me a great deal to hang out for 20 years for me to figure that out. Do you know what I mean? And so, he had his things to learn as well. But, I can't understand it from his point of view, only from my point of view. And when I looked at it like that and everything shifted, I now, even as you were speaking, go, okay, that moment that I had that intuition, was that simply my intuition saying, boy, have you got a lot to learn here?
In some ways, yeah, as in this is a moment you're never going to forget.
Yeah, exactly.
Because in that moment, as we talked about, you were pulled out of autopilot mode to take a picture mentally, emotionally, and physically of what was going on in that moment. And that's exactly what happened. I guess it's nice to be able to go back to that moment, even in the present day, and say, I get it now.
And I think, to be honest with you, Gareth, a lot of my growth has come from having those snapshots and being able to go back and go, so I wonder what that was really about, and what was that moment really there to teach me? Because they definitely are pivotal moments in our life. And I guess I want to come back to the trusting part, because I know it took me a long time to start to trust my intuition. And I know on some deep level that's because I don't trust myself. But I want to understand for other people what it is about ourselves that we just want to dismiss that inner knowing or that intuition.
In fear. Because as we talked about, it does come back to the unknown, and often us wanting to control a lot of the things around us. And when we're out of control, we both know the different, or when we feel we're out of control, we both know how that affects us. And it's very hard to build trust in an area of your life if you still don't understand why it exists or what you're actually going to benefit from it. So as long as there's certain question marks or unknowns, it's very hard to establish trust in it.
I would agree with that, because even just listening to what you said before, sometimes we're meant to act on it and sometimes we're not. And I go, and how's a girl supposed to know?
But often it's not even a choice. We think it is in that moment, but we're often being led. We just would rather we had more options because we don't like the way it's going. Again, control.
That's like my kryptonite, that word control. Yes, I just can't stand it when people say that to me. Because yes, I have spent my whole life trying to control everything, but that's beside the point. You know what I mean?
We tend to only trust when we feel we're in control.
True. I don't even want, you heard my big sigh. It's like, oh, I don't even really want to go down this path. But yes, We do tend to trust. I mean, can we train ourselves to trust when we're not in control?
Yeah. It's the road less traveled, but it is doable.
Mm.
But I feel it's that in order to let go of control and to trust in our own lives and our own journeys a little bit more, it does mean answering and exploring a lot of the question marks we have and still have around past experiences that we still don't understand. And if we still have question marks and unprocessed emotions, how can we ever really trust in life or trust in our intuition when we still have so many questions unanswered? So therefore, you can't expect anyone to trust in life when you feel like life has put you through so much and actually caused more trauma and no answers logically or emotionally.
I would agree with that. Because I felt that way for a long time. Life did put me through a lot, and I didn't understand it.
The interesting thing about intuition is that even if you don't trust it or can't control it, it still pops in when it wants to. You can't close the door on it.
And that's true.
It reminds you that you're not in control.
Yeah, and I spent a lot of time asking that why question. Why this? Why that? Why did this have to happen? I don't understand why. What I really didn't like, my favorite thing was to go to the shopping center and I would look at people that appeared to have a really nice life. And I would think, and how come they get to have such a nice life and I get to have my head dunked underwater every 5 seconds? And, I've since come to understand that I don't know if they're having a nice life or not. I don't know what's going on in their life. But I think for me, the moment I had that intuitive hit when I was working with a client, that all of my experiences were going to help me with the client, that was also one of those snapshot moments where I went, oh, this is why I've been through all of that. Mm-hmm. Is that also intuition?
It's the perfect intuition and definition and explanation for you in how your intuition is actually guiding you and understanding these experiences to help other people. And I feel a lot of people's automatic response is, if I've been through all of these different experiences in the past that I can't make sense of, then it must be that I need to process them in order to help other people. That's often people's immediate go-to, when often it's not always that case, as you and I both know. It's more about you understanding and processing it, and then life will guide you whether it's actually meant for other people to understand it or to actually do the journey with your information or not. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. That does. So not everybody has to understand their personal experiences in order to help other people, but we all need to understand our personal experiences in order for our life to unfold. Yeah. And I definitely hear that. So then when, sometimes you and I are talking and I'll ask you a question and you do why? I'm like, no, I don't. And you go, yes, you do. I think, no, I don't. I wouldn't ask you if I knew. What is that? And how does that relate to intuition?
Because often we do know the next step on our journey, but we tend to ask someone else in hopes that they give us a different answer. Because often the next step that we have to make in our life challenges a part of us mentally or emotionally, or really offers us the space to grow. But often, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but because of our difficult relationships with our emotions and our thoughts at times, growth is not the most exciting thing because it's also unknown. It can take us down a particular path or journey that can be filled with fear because we don't understand where it's actually taking us. So often the next step, which people often feel tends to have to always be a big step, when really the next step can actually be quite a small one, and just having a conversation you need to have with someone, but you have a tendency to keep putting it off because of either how it triggers you or how it triggers another person, or the fear that it's going to trigger another person. So people often think the next step's often a big thing. The bigger we think it is, the more likely we are not to do it. But when you simplify that maybe the next step is actually something very simple, it's then very hard to ignore and to put it off for an extended period of time. So we actually have, in some ways, not only the next step, we often have the next 10 steps in front of us of actually what we know we need to do, but we often don't want to do it, which is a very different thing.
Yes, and I relate to that in the fact of Often went in talking to people, they will discover what the end result they want, and they want to jump immediately to the end result and not the steps it takes to get to that end result. And of course, like most humans, I guess, we want to always have the positive end result. And so we're trying to figure out a way to get to that positive end result when there might not be a positive end result for that.
Yeah, because we're still so focused on a positive result or a negative result, but really it's the experience that's the result, and the emotions just come along anyway.
So I think that is where a lot of us would get tripped up. I know I got tripped up for a long time because we talk about the experience, and we've just been conditioned to always be looking for the positive experience instead of understanding that all experience, negative and positive, are what we're here to really experience and expand from.
It's our intuition that's quite aware of that fact of the experience will always have both. So therefore, even in those moments of questioning, your intuition still leads you down the aisle to marry someone who you might know is not what you think in that moment in time. This may not be correct. This may not be for me, whatever it might be. But your intuition or your energy, grace, your spirit is guiding you towards the experience of actually both positive and negative emotions that come along with it. And your energy is excited for that wealth of experience.
Okay, if you say so.
But us on a human level, though, not so much. But as you said, it's more down to the conditioning of us always wanting the more positive result.
So intuition is there to guide us, or we believe that it's there to guide us. So what is the point of having intuition if we're not always going to follow it?
And again, we may not follow it in the sense of how we've been taught to follow our intuition, but we're always following it even when we don't recognize that we are. There's parts in your life where your intuition will be very strong. There's other times where it feels non-existent or it seems non-existent depending on what's going on. But it is down to the experience at hand that we're meant to go through. And there are times in our life where we do have to recognize that we are here to be human. So therefore, the energy part of it is not always going to be that intense. So therefore, we can often be left with the emotions of what it means to be human and the thoughts of what it means to be human. So therefore, the energy part of it or the intuition isn't always there to guide us out of those places at times because we're meant to be there experiencing it to begin with.
Okay. And to me, that sounds a whole lot like that word acceptance, which, the relationship I have with acceptance is a whole nother podcast, but that's what that reminds me of when you say that. And that took a long time for me to get to the understanding that it's all unfolding exactly the way it's meant to unfold. And how my human mind wants to condition it isn't necessarily what I want it to be.
But that's exactly it. So it's us even accepting intuition and how it's actually been there for us through many different times in our life. And it's amazing how intuition doesn't change and how it communicates through us in these different levels. But our relationship and understanding of what intuition is throughout our lives definitely changes and develops. So often intuition is the first language we've known. And as we go through life, as we talked about, we've been taught to not trust ourselves and mind, body, emotions. And therefore, as spiritual beings, the energy in our path guides us and challenges us in mind, bodies, emotions in order to build a better relationship with ourselves and to be able to trust ourselves once again.
Bingo. And I think that's a great explanation of it. Thanks so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you would like to explore these topics more with us, please go to www.patreon.com/Practical Spirituality Podcast. Not only will that help us keep producing these shows, but you'll also get advance access to each new episode, the opportunity to ask questions directly of Gareth and I, input into what topics we will cover on the show, access to exclusive content not available anywhere else. See you over on Patreon.